In the narrow pass of Thermopylae, under a sky bruised with the threat of war, a mere 300 Spartans street-ooed shoulder to shoulder, their bronze armor glinting in the harsh Greek sun, facing an army so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. This was no mere battle. It was a defiance of fate itself, a moment in 480 BC where courage clashed with overwhelming might, and the echoes of that clash would reverberate through history. The Persian Empire, under the iron will of King Xerxes, had descended upon Greece with a force numbering in the hundreds of thousands, determined to crush the fractured city-states into submission. Yet, in this jagged mountain pass, a small band of warriors, led by the indomitable King Leonidas, chose to stand, to fight, and to die for a cause greater than themselves. What Hollywood's 300 painted as a mythic tale of glory is in truth a far more brutal, complex, and heartbreaking story, one of sacrifice, strategy, and the raw cost of freedom. To understand the true weight of Thermopylae, we must first step back into the world of 5th century BC Greece, a land of fierce independence and constant rivalry. The Greek city-states, from the militaristic Sparta to the intellectual Athens, were rarely united, often squabbling over territory and influence. Sparta, nestled in the Peloponnese, was a society forged in discipline and war, where boys were torn from their families at the age of 7 to endure the brutal training of the agoge, emerging as warriors who knew no fear, only duty. Their lives were dedicated to the state, their bodies honed as weapons, and their minds steeled against weakness. King Leonidas, a man in his late 40s or early 50s by the time of Thermopylae, was the embodiment of this Spartan ideal, battle-hardened, resolute, and fiercely loyal to his people. He was not just a king but a symbol of Sparta's unyielding spirit, a leader who, according to the ancient historian Herodotus, traced his lineage back to the demigod Heracles himself. Across the Aegean Sea loomed a far greater power, the Persian Empire, a colossus that stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Mediterranean. Under King Xerxes I, son of Darius the Great, Persia sought to expand its dominion, driven by both ambition and vengeance. A decade earlier, in 490 BC, the Greeks had humiliated Darius at the Battle of Marathon, where a smaller Athenian force repelled a Persian invasion. That defeat burned in the Persian memory, and Xerxes, ascending to the throne in 486 BC, vowed to finish what his father started. He amassed an army of staggering size. Modern estimates suggest between 100,000 and 300,000 men, though ancient sources like Herodotus claim figures as high as 2 million, likely exaggerated for dramatic effect. This was not just a military campaign, it was a statement of imperial might, a force meant to crush any resistance and bring Greece to its knees. Xerxes' army included soldiers from across his vast empire, Medes, Assyrians, Egyptians, and more, alongside the elite immortals, a 10,000-strong unit of Persia's finest warriors, clad in scale armor and wielding deadly precision. The stage for Thermopylae was set in a Greece already trembling under the shadow of invasion. By the summer of 480 BC, Xerxes had crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, on a massive bridge of boats, a feat of engineering that symbolized his determination to conquer. Northern Greek states, fearing annihilation, submitted to Persian rule without a fight, while others, like Athens and Sparta, refused to bow. A fragile alliance formed among the resisting city-states, but unity was tenuous at best. Athens, with its powerful navy, prepared to defend the seas, while Sparta, renowned for its land-based warriors, took up the mantle of leading the ground defense. Yet, even as the Greeks rallied, the sheer scale of the Persian advance seemed insurmountable. Messengers reported the enemy's approach, their numbers so great that the ground itself seemed to quake under their march. It was in this atmosphere of dread and desperation that the decision was made to hold the line at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass where the mountains met the sea, a natural bottleneck that could negate the Persians' numerical advantage. Thermopylae, meaning hot gates due to the nearby sulfur springs, was a choke point barely wide enough for a handful of men to stand abreast in some sections. Flanked by steep cliffs on one side and the Gulf of Melis on the other, it was the perfect defensive position, a place where thousands could be held at bay by mere hundreds. Leonidas, chosen to lead the Greek forces, understood the strategic value of this pass. It was the key to delaying Xerxes' advance, buying time for the other Greek states to muster their defenses. But he also knew the cost. The oracle at Delphi, consulted before the battle, had delivered a chilling prophecy. Either Sparta would lose a king, or it would fall to the invaders. Leonidas, as Herodotus tells us, interpreted this to mean his own death was inevitable, yet he marched to Thermopylae regardless, handpicking 300 of Sparta's finest warriorsmen with living sons to ensure their bloodlines would endure. These were not just soldiers. They were fathers, husbands, and brothers, each prepared to sacrifice everything for their homeland. This was no Hollywood fantasy of invincible heroes. The real story of Thermopylae is one of grim resolve, of men staring into the abyss of certain death and choosing to stand anyway. Leonidas and his 300 were not alone, contrary to popular myth. They were joined by several thousand allied troops from other Greek states, including Thespians, Thebans, and Phocians, totaling around 7,000 men at the battle's outset. Yet even this combined force was a mere fraction of the Persian juggernaut bearing down on them. As the summer heat bore down and the enemy's dust clouds darkened the horizon, the Greeks fortified their position, rebuilding a low wall known as the Phocian Wall to further narrow the pass. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that every hour they held Xerxes at bay was an hour gained for Greece to prepare. This was the brutal truth of Thermopylae. It was never about victory, but about defiance in the face of annihilation. As the summer of 480 BC scorched the rugged Greek landscape, the shadow of the Persian Empire grew ever darker over the fractured city-states. King Xerxes I, driven by a thirst for conquest and the bitter sting of his father's defeat at Marathon a decade earlier, had unleashed a military campaign of unprecedented scale. His army, a mosaic of cultures and warriors from across his vast dominion, marched with a singular purpose: to subjugate Greece and erase the humiliation of past failures. Ancient accounts, though often inflated, speak of a force so immense that it drank rivers dry and cast a pall of dust over the land as it moved. Modern historians estimate Xerxes' numbers at anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000, a staggering figure against the meager thousands the Greeks could muster. This was not merely an invasion, it was an existential threat, a tidal wave of imperial ambition poised to drown the fragile freedoms of a divided people. In the face of this looming catastrophe, the Greek city-states, long plagued by infighting, were forced into an uneasy alliance. Sparta and Athens, the two most powerful among them, stood at the forefront of resistance, though their approaches to war could not have been more different. Sparta, a landlocked warrior society, relied on its unparalleled hoplite infantry, men trained from childhood to fight as a single unbreakable unit in the phalanx formation. Their lives were austere, their discipline absolute, and their loyalty to the state unwavering. Athens, by contrast, was a maritime power, its strength lying in a formidable navy that could challenge Persian control of the seas. Yet, even as these two giants coordinated their efforts, mistrust simmered beneath the surface. Other city-states, like Thebes and Argos, wavered in their commitment, some even considering submission to Xerxes to spare themselves the horrors of war. The Greek coalition, fragile as it was, knew that unity was their only hope, but achieving it in the face of such overwhelming odds seemed a near impossible task. The decision to defend Thermopylae was born of desperate strategy. Located in central Greece, the narrow pass was a natural fortress, a bottleneck where the sheer numbers of the Persian army could be rendered less effective. Flanked by towering cliffs and the sea, the pass was so constricted in places that only a handful of men could fight abreast, neutralizing the advantage of Xerxes' vast horde. Leonidas, the Spartan king chosen to lead the defense, understood the symbolic and tactical importance of this stand. He was a man forged by battle, a leader who had seen the cost of war and bore the weight of his city's expectations. According to Herodotus, the ancient historian who chronicled these events, Leonidas was guided by a grim prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi. Sparta would either lose a king or be destroyed. Accepting his fate with the stoicism of a true Spartan, Leonidas selected 300 of his finest warriors, each a father with a living son, to ensure their family lines would continue and marched north to hold the line. But contrary to the Hollywood myth of a lone Spartan stand, Leonidas did not go alone. He was joined by contingents from other Greek states, including 700 Thespians, 400 Thebans, and several thousand others, forming a force of roughly 7,000 men. This was a coalition of the willing, a patchwork army united by the shared dread of Persian domination. As the Greeks prepared their defenses at Thermopylae, fortifying the narrowest sections with a rebuilt stone wall, the Persian advance grew ever closer. Xerxes, seated on a throne of gold overlooking his endless ranks, exuded confidence. He had already subdued much of northern Greece without a fight, as city-states like Thessaly bent the knee rather than face annihilation. His army was a marvel of organization, supported by a vast supply chain and a navy that shadowed the land forces along the coast. Among his elite were the Immortals, a 10,000-strong unit of Persia's best, named for their practice of immediately replacing any fallen soldier to maintain their numbers. Xerxes believed the Greeks would crumble before his might, as so many others had. He sent emissaries ahead of his army, demanding earth and water as tokens of submission. When these messengers reached Sparta, the response was characteristically defiant. Legend has it they were thrown into a well with the retort, "Dig it out for yourselves." Such insolence only fueled Xerxes' resolve to crush these stubborn holdouts. The tension at Thermopylae was palpable as the Greeks awaited the inevitable. Scouts reported the Persian approach, their campfires lighting up the night like a second horizon. The ground itself seemed to tremble under the weight of their march, and the air grew thick with the dust of countless boots. Leonidas and his men knew they were outnumbered beyond comprehension, yet they held their ground with a resolve born of necessity. The Spartan king deployed his forces with precision, placing his 300 at the forefront of the phalanx, their long spears and heavy shields forming an impenetrable wall of bronze. Allied troops supported the flanks and rear, while others were tasked with guarding nearby mountain paths that could expose their position. Every man understood the stakes. Thermopylae was not just a battle for territory, but a fight for the very soul of Greece. If they failed, the path to the heart of their homeland Athens, Sparta, and beyond would lie open to the invaders. But beneath the surface of this united front, cracks were already forming. Some of the allied contingents, particularly the Thebans, were suspected of divided loyalties, their commitment to the cause uncertain. Leonidas, ever the pragmatist, positioned these less reliable troops where they could be watched, ensuring the core of his defense remained uncompromised. Meanwhile, the Persians, encamped just beyond the pass, began to probe the Greek defenses with skirmishers, testing their resolve. Xerxes, observing from a vantage point, reportedly laughed at the sight of so few daring to oppose him, believing the battle would be over in a day. He could not have foreseen the ferocity with which these outnumbered warriors would fight, nor the price his army would pay for every inch of ground. As the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains, the stage was set for a confrontation that would defy all expectations, a clash of wills, of steel, and of unyielding determination in the face of certain doom. As the sun rose over the jagged cliffs of Thermopylae, On that fateful day in the 4th of August 80 BC, the narrow pass reverberated with the distant thunder of the Persian advance. The Greek defenders, led by the steely King Leonidas, stood resolute behind their rebuilt stone wall, their bronze armor gleaming with the sweat of anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur from the nearby hot springs and the dust kicked up by an army so vast it seemed to stretch into eternity. Xerxes, perched on a gilded throne overlooking the battlefield, surveyed the meager Greek line with a mix of amusement and impatience. He had expected submission, not defiance, and the audacity of these few thousand men daring to block his path to conquest ignited a slow-burning fury within him. The stage was set for a battle that would test the limits of human endurance, where courage would collide with overwhelming force in a brutal dance of death. The first day of the battle began with a chilling stillness, broken only by the rhythmic march of Persian boots. Xerxes, confident in his numerical superiority, sent forward his initial waves lightly armed troops from subject nations, meant to test the Greek defenses and wear them down. These soldiers, many pressed into service from distant corners of the empire, charged into the narrow pass with spears and wicker shields, only to be met by the impenetrable wall of the Greek phalanx. The Spartans at the forefront fought with a precision born of lifelong training, their long spears thrusting in unison to cut down the attackers before they could even close the distance. Bodies piled up at the base of the Phocian wall, the ground growing slick with blood, as wave after wave of Persians fell to the disciplined Greek line. Herodotus recounts how the Spartans rotated their front ranks to maintain their strength, ensuring no man tired too quickly, while their allies, the Thespians, Phocians, and others shelled the flanks with grim determination. The Persians, unable to bring their full numbers to bear in the confined space, suffered staggering losses for little gain. Xerxes, watching from his vantage point, grew increasingly frustrated as the day wore on. The narrow pass of Thermopylae, barely wide enough for a dozen men to fight abreast, nullified his army's greatest asset its size. What should have been a swift rout was turning into a grinding slog, each inch of ground paid for in rivers of blood. In a bid to break the deadlock, he ordered his elite immortals into the fray, a force of 10,000 of Persia's finest warriors, clad in scale armor and wielding deadly skill. These were no mere conscripts. They were the backbone of the Persian military, feared across the known world for their discipline and ferocity. Yet even they faltered against the Spartan wall. The Greeks, fighting in tight formation, turned the pass into a meat grinder, their heavy shields and longer spears giving them a lethal edge in close quarters. Herodotus describes how the Spartans would feign retreat, luring the immortals forward, only to turn and slaughter them in a devastating counterattack. By the end of the first day, the Persian dead littered the pass, their bodies a testament to the Greeks' unyielding resolve, while Xerxes' confidence began to crack under the weight of unexpected resistance. The second day dawned with a renewed Persian assault, Xerxes now driven by a mix of rage and desperation. He had underestimated these Greeks, believing their small numbers would crumble under sustained pressure, but the defenders showed no sign of breaking. The Spartan King Leonidas, ever the tactician, inspired his men with a calm that belied the chaos around them. Ancient accounts tell of his laconic wit, a hallmark of Spartan culture, as he urged his warriors to fight not for glory, but for the survival of their way of life. The allied Greeks, though less disciplined than the Spartans, drew strength from their example, holding their ground despite the relentless onslaught. The Persians, attacking in greater numbers and with heavier troops, pressed harder, their arrows darkening the sky in volleys meant to weaken the Greek line before the infantry charged. Yet the defenders, sheltered by their large shields and the narrow terrain, weathered the storm, their casualties minimal compared to the mounting toll on the invaders. The pass became a charnel house, the air thick with the cries of the wounded and the stench of death, as the Greeks repelled assault after assault. Beneath the surface of this heroic stand, however, tension simmered among the Greek coalition. Not all the allies shared the Spartans' ironclad commitment to fight to the death. The Thebans, in particular, were rumored to harbor pro-Persian sympathies, their loyalty to the cause questioned by their comrades. Leonidas, aware of these divisions, kept a wary eye on his less reliable contingents, positioning them where they could do the least harm if their resolve faltered. Meanwhile, the physical toll of the battle began to weigh on even the hardiest warriors. 2 days of constant fighting, with little rest and the ever-present threat of encirclement, tested the limits of human endurance. The Greeks knew they could not hold indefinitely. Their goal was to delay Xerxes, to buy time for the rest of Greece to muster a defense. But each hour brought them closer to the breaking point. Supplies dwindled, wounds accumulated, and the specter of betrayal loomed ever larger, a shadow cast by whispers of a hidden path through the mountains that could undo their entire strategy. As the sun set on the second day, Xerxes' frustration boiled over into a dangerous resolve. He had lost thousands of men to this stubborn band of Greeks, a humiliation that stung deeper with each passing hour. His advisors, sensing his growing impatience, scoured the surrounding terrain for any advantage, any weakness in the Greek position. The stage was set for a turning point, a moment that would shift the balance of this brutal struggle and expose the true cost of defiance. For Leonidas and his men, the battle was far from over, but the cracks in their defense, both physical and political, were beginning to show. The narrow pass of Thermopylae, once their greatest strength, would soon become the crucible of their greatest test, as the weight of an empire bore down with unrelenting force. As the third day of the Battle of Thermopylae dawned in the 4th of August 80 BC, the narrow pass was a scarred and blood-soaked testament to the ferocity of the Greek defense. The bodies of fallen Persians lay in heaps before the Phocian wall, a grim barrier of flesh and bone that spoke of the staggering cost Xerxes had paid for every failed assault. King Leonidas and his coalition of roughly 7,000 Greek Spartans, Thespians, Thebans, and others stood weary but unbroken, their bronze armor dented, and their bodies aching from 2 days of relentless combat. The air hung heavy with the stench of death and the acrid tang of sweat, yet the defenders' resolve burned as fiercely as ever. They knew their stand was buying precious time for the rest of Greece to rally, but they also knew their position was precarious, a fragile thread holding back an unstoppable tide. Unbeknownst to them, the seeds of their undoing had already been sown, not by the might of the Persian army, but by the treachery of one of their own. Xerxes, seething with frustration after 2 days of futile attacks, had grown desperate for a breakthrough. His vast army, though still formidable, was hemorrhaging men at an unsustainable rate, and the narrow confines of Thermopylae continued to thwart his numerical advantage. It was then that fate or betrayal delivered him the key to victory. A local Greek, a man named Ephialtes of Trachis, approached the Persian camp under the cover of darkness with a devastating secret. For a promise of reward, he revealed the existence of a hidden mountain path, known as the Anopeia Trail, that wound through the cliffs above Thermopylae and emerged behind the Greek position. This narrow track, guarded by a small contingent of Phocian troops under Leonidas's command, was the defenders' Achilles' heel of vulnerability they had hoped would remain undiscovered. Xerxes, seizing the opportunity, dispatched a force of his elite immortals under the command of Hydarnes to traverse the path and encircle the Greeks. As the Persians moved silently through the night, guided by the traitor Ephialtes, the noose began to tighten around Leonidas and his men. The Phocian guards, tasked with protecting the mountain path, were caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the immortals. Herodotus recounts how the rustling of leaves underfoot alerted them to the enemy's approach, but it was too late to mount an effective defense. The Phocians, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, fled to a nearby hill, leaving the path open for the Persians to descend upon the Greek rear. Word of the betrayal reached Leonidas at dawn, likely through a runner or scout, and the gravity of the situation became painfully clear. Their position was no longer tenable. Encircled by Xerxes's forces, with the main army pressing from the front and the immortals closing in from behind, the Greeks faced a brutal choice: retreat or stand and fight to the last. For Leonidas, a Spartan king bound by honor and the prophecy of his own death, the decision was never in doubt. He would not abandon his post, nor would he allow Sparta's name to be stained by retreat. But he also recognized the futility of sacrificing every man under his command. In a moment of grim pragmatism, Leonidas ordered the bulk of the Greek forces to withdraw, urging them to save themselves and continue the fight elsewhere. Many of the allied contingents, including the Thebans who later surrendered to Xerxes, took this chance to escape the impending slaughter. Yet not all would leave. The 300 Spartans, bound by their code of honor, chose to remain with their king, as did 700 Thespians under their leader Thermopylae, who refused to abandon their comrades despite the certainty of death. A small number of others, including some Helot Spartan serfs, also stayed, bringing the total of those who stood for the final stand to around 1,400. This was no longer a battle for strategic gain. It was a sacrifice, a deliberate act of defiance meant to delay the Persians for as long as possible, to etch a message of resistance into the annals of history with their blood. As the larger Greek force retreated, Leonidas and his remaining warriors prepared for their final hours, their faces set with the stoic determination of men who had already accepted their fate. The encirclement tightened as the Persian forces converged. From the front, wave after wave of infantry pressed against the dwindling Greek line, while from the rear, the immortals descended with lethal precision. The once impenetrable phalanx began to fracture under the dual assault, the narrow pass that had been their strength now becoming their tomb. The Greeks fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their spears snapping and their shields battered as they cut down scores of enemies. Herodotus describes how, when their weapons broke, they fought with swords, then with daggers, and finally with their bare hands and teeth, refusing to yield even as their numbers dwindled. The Spartans, trained to fight to the death, formed a tight knot around Leonidas, protecting their king with their lives as the enemy closed in. The Thespians, equally resolute, held their ground beside their Spartan allies, their courage a silent rebuke to the betrayal that had doomed them. Every moment they held was a moment gained for Greece, but the cost was unimaginable. Wounds gaped, blood flowed freely, and the cries of the dying echoed off the cliffs. As the day wore on, the Greek position crumbled into a brutal, chaotic melee. The Persians, now able to bring their numbers to bear, overwhelmed the defenders through sheer attrition. Leonidas, fighting at the forefront, became a target for Xerxes' wrath, and though accounts differ, it is believed he fell in the thick of the battle, struck down by a hail of arrows or a direct assault by the immortals. His death marked the beginning of the end. Yet even then, the surviving Spartans and Thespians refused to surrender, rallying around their fallen king in a last, desperate stand. The pass of Thermopylae, once a bastion of hope, had become a crucible of suffering, its narrow confines trapping the Greeks in a vice of steel and death. The brutal truth of their decline was not just in the physical toll, but in the shattering realization that their sacrifice, though heroic, could not stem the Persian tide forever. The sun hung low over the blood-drenched pass of Thermopylae on that fateful third day in the 4th of August 80 BC, casting long shadows over a scene of unimaginable carnage. The once defiant Greek position had been reduced to a shrinking knot of warriors, surrounded on all sides by the relentless Persian horde. King Leonidas, the lion-hearted Spartan leader, lay dead or dying amidst the chaos, his body a rallying point for the few hundred who remained, his 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and a handful of others who had chosen to stand with them to the bitter end. The narrow pass, once their strategic stronghold, had become their sepulchre, its cliffs echoing with the clash of steel and the guttural cries of men locked in a dance of death. Betrayed by Ephialtes and encircled by Xerxes' elite immortals, the Greeks faced annihilation. yet their spirits burned with a ferocity that defied the inevitability of their doom. This was the climactic hour of Thermopylae, a moment of raw, brutal sacrifice that would sear itself into the memory of history. With Leonidas fallen struck down, as Herodotus suggests, by a barrage of Persian arrows, or in close combat with the immortals, the surviving Spartans formed a desperate circle around their king's body, determined to protect it from desecration. Their phalanx, once an unbreakable wall of bronze and discipline, had shattered under the dual assault from front and rear, leaving them to fight in small, ragged clusters. The Thespians, led by the steadfast Demophiles, stood shoulder to shoulder with their Spartan allies, their resolve unshaken despite the certainty of death. The Persians, now able to press their numerical advantage in the opened battlefield, surged forward with renewed vigor, their spears and swords flashing in the fading light. Yet even as their numbers dwindled, the Greeks fought with a savagery that stunned their enemies. When their spears snapped, they drew their short swords. When their swords dulled, they wielded broken hilts and bare fists, tearing into the enemy with the ferocity of cornered beasts. Blood soaked the earth, mingling with the dust to form a crimson mire, as the defenders exacted a horrific toll for every life taken. Xerxes, observing from his gilded throne on a nearby ridge, watched the slaughter unfold with a mix of awe and fury. He had expected a swift victory after the betrayal of the mountain path, yet these stubborn Greeks refused to yield, turning their inevitable defeat into a grueling ordeal for his army. The Persian king, driven by both impatience and a desire for vengeance, ordered his troops to overwhelm the remnants without mercy, even at the cost of heavy casualties. Arrows rained down in deadly volleys, piercing armor and flesh alike, while wave after wave of infantry charged into the fray. The Spartans and Thespians, now reduced to mere dozens, retreated to a small hillock near the pass known later as the Kolonos Hill, making their final stand in a space so confined that the Persians could barely maneuver. Herodotus recounts how the Greeks, exhausted and wounded, fought until they could fight no more, their bodies piling up as a grim testament to their unyielding spirit. The Spartans, true to their code, neither surrendered nor fled, embodying the ethos drilled into them since childhood: return with your shield or on it. The final moments of the battle were a tableau of tragic heroism, a scene so visceral it would haunt the survivors and echo through the ages. As the last of the defenders fell, the Persians closed in, their numbers finally overwhelming the battered remnants. The body of Leonidas, a prize for Xerxes' wrath, was seized despite the Greeks' desperate efforts to protect it. In a chilling act of desecration, Xerxes ordered the king's head severed and mounted on a pike, a grotesque display of victory meant to break the spirit of any remaining resistance. The bodies of the fallen Greeks, nearly 1,400 in total from this last stand, lay strewn across the pass, their blood staining the earth where they had made their stand. The Persians, though victorious, had paid a staggering price. Modern estimates suggest they lost upwards of 20,000 men over the 3 days, a toll that spoke to the ferocity of the Greek defense. The narrow confines of Thermopylae, once a bottleneck that favored the defenders, had become a graveyard, its sulfur-scented air thick with the weight of loss and sacrifice. This was the brutal truth Hollywood glossed over a last stand not of mythic invincibility, but of human frailty and unflinching resolve. The 300 Spartans and their allies did not fight for glory or personal gain, but for a cause greater than themselves: the survival of their homeland and the ideals of freedom that defined it. Their deaths were not clean or cinematic. They were messy, agonizing, and profoundly real, marked by the screams of the wounded and the relentless grind of attrition. Leonidas, in his final moments, fulfilled the Delphic prophecy that a Spartan king must die to save his city, his sacrifice a beacon of defiance against an empire that sought to crush all opposition. The fall of Thermopylae was not just the end of a battle, but the shattering of a fragile hope, a moment where the cost of resistance was laid bare in the most harrowing terms. Yet even in defeat, the Greeks had struck a blow deeper than Xerxes could fathom, planting the seeds of inspiration that would rally their countrymen in the battles to come. As the dust settled over the pass, the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the rustle of Persian soldiers scavenging the battlefield. The hot gates had borne witness to a clash of wills that transcended mere military strategy, a stand that would resonate far beyond the bloodied ground on which it was fought. For Xerxes, the victory was hollow, marred by the immense losses and the lingering specter of Greek defiance. For the fallen, their story was not yet over. Their sacrifice would become a rallying cry, a reminder of what could be achieved in the face of impossible odds. The tragic fall of Leonidas and his men marked the darkest hour of Thermopylae, but it also lit a fire that would burn through the heart of Greece, refusing to be extinguished. In the eerie quiet that followed the slaughter at Thermopylae in the 4th of August 80 BC, the narrow pass lay as a somber monument to the fallen. The bodies of nearly 1,400 Greeks, Leonidas's 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and others who stood with them were strewn across the blood-soaked earth, their sacrifice a stark contrast to the vast Persian army that now moved to secure its hard-won victory. Xerxes, though triumphant, could not mask the bitter taste of the cost. His forces had suffered losses estimated at 20,000 or more, a staggering toll for a battle against so few. In a final act of spite, the Persian king ordered the mutilation of Leonidas's body, his head impaled on a pike as a grim trophy of conquest. Yet even this desecration could not erase the impact of the Greek stand. The hot gates had been breached, but the spirit of defiance lingered in the air, a silent challenge to the invaders as they pressed southward into the heart of Greece. The immediate aftermath of Thermopylae was a dark chapter for the Greek city-states. With the pass lost, Xerxes' army poured into central Greece, meeting little resistance as fear and despair gripped the land. The city of Athens, a primary target of Persian vengeance, was evacuated in haste, its citizens fleeing to the island of Salamis under the protection of their powerful navy. The Persians sacked the abandoned city, burning the Acropolis and leaving a scar of destruction in their wake. Meanwhile, Sparta and its Peloponnesian allies retreated behind the Isthmus of Corinth, fortifying a narrow strip of land in a desperate bid to halt the advance. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had bought precious time for the Greeks to regroup, to muster their forces, and to prepare for the next phase of the war, but it came at a devastating cost. The northern and central regions fell under Persian control, and the fragile alliance of city-states teetered on the brink of collapse, with some, like Thebes, choosing submission over continued resistance. The betrayal by Ephialtes, whose name would become synonymous with treachery in Greek lore, cast a long shadow, a reminder of the internal divisions that threatened to undo the coalition. Yet, even as Xerxes marched onward, the story of Thermopylae began to take root as a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. News of Leonidas's stand spread among the Greeks, carried by survivors and messengers, transforming the defeat into a rallying cry. The courage of the 300 Spartans and their allies, who fought to the last man against impossible odds, ignited a fire of resistance that refused to be quenched. Just weeks after Thermopylae, the Greek navy, led by Athens under the strategic genius of Themistocles, dealt a crushing blow to the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis, shattering Xerxes' naval dominance and forcing him to retreat with much of his army. The following year, in 479 BC, the Greeks achieved decisive victories at Plataea and Mycale, driving the Persians from their shores for good. The stand at Thermopylae, though a tactical loss, had played a crucial role in delaying the enemy, giving the Greeks the breathing room needed to organize these counterstrikes. Leonidas's sacrifice was not in vain. It became the bedrock of a narrative that united a fractured people in their fight for freedom. The legacy of Thermopylae endured far beyond the immediate war, etched into the cultural memory of Greece and, later, the world. In Sparta, The fallen were honored as heroes, their names celebrated in songs and rituals that reinforced the city's martial ethos. A stone lion was erected at the site of the battle, marking the spot where Leonidas fell, while an epitaph attributed to the poet Simonides immortalized the defenders with haunting simplicity. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. This inscription, preserved by Herodotus, captured the essence of their sacrifice obedience to duty, even unto death. Over centuries, Thermopylae became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a story invoked by generations to inspire courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet history also buried some truths. The contributions of the Thespians and other allies were often overshadowed by the Spartan mythos, their equal bravery relegated to footnotes in the shadow of Leonidas's legend. Hollywood's portrayal in 300 further distorted the reality, painting a hyper-stylized fantasy of invincible warriors while glossing over the brutal human cost and the complex political dynamics at play. The true story of Thermopylae is not one of mythic glory, but of raw, unflinching sacrifice, a moment where ordinary men, bound by duty and desperation, stood against an empire and paid the ultimate price. It is a tale of courage, yes, but also of betrayal, loss, and the harsh realities of war that no film can fully capture. The pass of Thermopylae, with its sulfur springs and jagged cliffs, remains a quiet witness to that struggle, its landscape altered by time yet still resonant with the echoes of clashing steel and dying breaths. What lingers most is not the victory or defeat, but the question of what we are willing to sacrifice for the ideals we hold dear. How far would we go, when faced with an unstoppable force, to protect our way of life? The men of Thermopylae answered with their lives, leaving us to ponder the weight of their choice across the millennia. If you've been moved by this brutal truth behind the legend, share your thoughts. What does their stand mean to you? And how do we honor such sacrifices in our own time? Let's keep this conversation alive, reflecting on a moment in history that refuses to be forgotten.